Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer. Our guest this morning is Randal Smathers, who has been the director of the Rutland Free Library for the last 10 years. Welcome, Randal.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
And we are going to explore the topic of libraries past, present, and future, and certainly touch upon near the end of the show the direction that the Vermont State Libraries has taken about digitization. But before we do that, let's just have a conversation of someone who is dedicating his life now to libraries. And how do you think libraries have evolved? So if we roll back in time in communities, because I think libraries historically, public and libraries is really something of recent history, because libraries like the Vatican Library, etc., were repositories of books, but they weren't necessarily places which the public could take out books or access information.
And that history has a place in Rutland as well. Public libraries are pretty much the same lifespan as the United States. Ben Franklin was famous for having been a library founder, but the library that Ben Franklin founded was not a public library as we think of it today. It was a subscription library. Rich people paid money so that they would have access to lots of books. That's not what we think of as a library. Mm-hmm. But in Rutland, there is still the traces of a library, a subscription library, and that's on Library Avenue. If you're wondering why the library is not on Library Avenue, there was a library, the beautiful stone building that is now the Jewish Center. Library and Grove Street was built as a subscription library by the family that owned Vermont Marble Company, mm-hmm. and it was a private subscription library. Mm-hmm. I have been able to find information about when it opened in the 19-teens, not when it closed, so I don't know. They didn't make a big deal of closing a library mm-hmm. so much as opening one. But it was in business for some years, probably a decade or so, as a private library in the city of Vermont, or city of Rutland. So we have experience of both. The public has outlasted the private, and I'm looking forward to it being in operation for a long time. I think it's a business model with legs. Mm-hmm.
And among the models of libraries that have limited access are, of course, historical society libraries. And I think that we could make a segue from historical libraries that I have frequented, like the Maine Historical Society in Portland. There are several in Boston. But 40 years ago, when I first moved to Vermont, the Vermont Room was on the second floor. Mm-hmm. You had to be buzzed to go upstairs, mm-hmm. and it was done under the auspices of keeping those books safe. But it was an enormous annoyance, because you would ascend this stairway and you would look down. We didn't have the wall in mm-hmm. the atrium then, and you would have to wait for whoever was on duty to buzz you upstairs. So when the present library had a major renovation around 1990, and it was closed, and I know this is before you were moved to Rutland, but all the books were moved to the plaza,
yes.
Approximately where Price Chopper is now. Not all of the books were in circulation. There was a book on the cartoonist Thomas Nast that I used to take out every year when I was doing reconstruction, and that book disappeared in the move. So I don't know if someone pilfered it.
Sure.
I can't imagine it was thrown away, but I think that was the beginning of a modern era for the Rutland Free Library, of making the Vermont collection more accessible right on the first floor. But one thing I do want to just talk about with the role of libraries, particularly you, never being at the reference desk because you're always helping someone find something. Let me tell you a story. 40 years ago, when I was teaching American literature at MSJ, I had an anthology of American literature that was printed around 1978. There was a favorite short story of mine in the anthology, The Jilting of Granny Weatherall by Catherine Ann Porter. And the way that the anthology was set up, there were author bios right after the short story along with study guide questions. So the kid would say to me, Mr. Dwyer, look at this woman. She's wicked old. She was born in 1890. I said, I think she died, but how would I know? So our library at MSJ had World Book encyclopedias to about 1980. We had the annual that would come out. We had a set of Britannica that went to about 1978. So after school, I went to the reference desk. Jake Sherman was on the desk, and I said, Jake, because we know this man has an encyclopedic mind.
Sure.
And I said, is Catherine Ann Porter dead? I think so. When? It took us 45 minutes to ascertain that Catherine Ann Porter died in 1981. And the point of this story is that that piece of information could be located anywhere at any time. Someone could take their phone, even speak in the name into a search engine and up it comes. And that's how much I think the role of libraries has changed as the repository of referenced information. And the other thing that I would be happy to have you weigh in on is how much the public function of libraries have changed. I was on the board of the McClure Library for some years, and major changes as to what people expected in the library. So this is part of the ongoing change, but certainly in your adulthood and your coming to this community, how has the present role of a library changed? What do people come to a library seeking?
Wow, that's an enormous undertaking to even list all the uses. A variety. One of the big roles is early literacy. A lot of families come in with kids, get them excited about books, get them excited about reading. It's a socialization opportunity. My oldest is in college. Several of his peers from Rutland were following in their college careers, and they met at story time, 18 years ago, 19 years ago. So that role is certainly still there. There is the finding of information that you're talking about, the seeking of a specific piece of information, or working on a given paper, for high school or personal information. We don't ask why somebody wants to know when Catherine Ann Porter died. You want to know, we'll help you find the information. There is an archival function, and I think your tale of how it used to work is kind of instructive on that. And then people just come to be present, whether it's for a meeting or a yoga class or a quiet place to sit and read, or sometimes not so quiet if the kids' programs are going well. So it really covers an enormous gamut. There's no one reason for us to be there. There's 100 reasons for us to be there. I did want to kind of touch on the different variation on how you access archival information, though, because that really varies. It varies from library to library. It varies from within our collection. It varies from book to book. We do maintain a locked case for titles that we would have a very hard time replacing. We did have to move some books into that case a few years ago. They were a series of maps. You're probably familiar with the Beers maps of 1885, republished in 1969, I believe, by the Tuttle Company right here in Rutland. And it turned out that you could cut a page out of that, mount it into a frame like this, and sell it on eBay for $350 a frame, which turned a single book into about $6,000 worth of income for an unscrupulous person. So those are now in the lock case. I would be delighted to have them available for people to find and browse, because they're a fantastic resource. almost everybody who comes in to do genealogy work who had family in Vermont, not just Rutland, because we have them statewide, in that era, almost everybody who comes in is overjoyed to find it. They find their ancestors' dwelling place. They're excited. There's that moment of discovery. It's the aha moment of what we're doing. But if we don't keep it behind locked doors, then it becomes a theft target. So that's always a kind of a push-pull dichotomy for a librarian or for an archivist. I don't know about your college. My college, the pride of its collection was a couple of pages of the Gutenberg Bible. They didn't have a complete Bible, but they had some pages. And if you wanted to see the Gutenberg pages, you made an appointment. You came in, there was an enormous glass wall between you and the materials. They got your little card. They brought the piece you were interested in looking at. In the case of the Gutenberg, I was in grad studies in English, and so our class was brought in. They presented the book to us. They had gloves on to make sure that they didn't get any oils off their fingers onto the pages, which could lead them to be harmed. They set them in front of you. You looked through the perfectly clean glass and looked at the page and went, yep, that's really pretty impressive. Which is not the same as flipping through one of our old books and finding something that interests you and going, wow, this is, I didn't know. So it's very much appointment viewing versus discovery. And I think as long as there are originals that people want to preserve, that you're going to have that. Should we preserve it? Should we make it really available? So the idea of putting the entire collection behind glass doors kind of shocks me, but I understand why you do it. Totally cool. Thank you for sharing that story.
The other joy of any library for me is perusing the stacks.
Oh, yes.
And growing up in Fall River, Massachusetts, the library was a magnificent building called the People's University. But until I left Fall River to go to college, it was very much a segregated library because children were not really allowed upstairs. So when I had gone through all of the Hardy Boys and then, Nancy Drew, I must confess afterwards, I couldn't take out books from upstairs, but I had an older friend, and she would go up, and the deal was that you could take out 14 books at a time, and you had to stamp the card like that. But the stacks were closed, and part of the whole thing is, well, they're too crowded. We don't want people hanging out in the stacks. So finally, when the stacks were open and they had those semi-transparent floors, so you could actually see the footprints because they were very much stacks.
That's
weird. Yeah, but to me, just being able to look at, I would go through the 920s and go, oh, okay, I've gone through most of the A's. Now let me see whom we have biographies for with B's, etc. But also in my collegiate experience, I always picked a favorite study carrel at the end of stacks. And when I would get a little bit distracted, I would just peruse and go searching and pull books out. But in terms of do not reshelve, I have to tell you from time to time, I have broken the rule. I don't know if it's still in effect.
You're a bad person.
But especially when it was upstairs, do not reshelve. So I would go in, and there was one gentleman, I don't think you ever knew him, Carmine Paca, and he spent every day in the Vermont room. I think he was writing a history of the Battle of Hubbardton. And I would want certain books, like I would want the 1929 volume of the New England Historic Genealogical Register. It'd be the gap on the shelf. So I would look on the table, and it would be, down 3 or 4. So sometimes I would put things back, but I would put them back correctly. One thing before we talk about some of the
I have to just pause and say, please don't do that. For those of you at home, please do not
follow my bad example.
Well, there's two reasons. One is we do trust you, Michael, to reshelve correctly. We don't necessarily feel everybody has that skill. But the other thing is we do periodically need to weed the library, and to do that we need to know what is popular. And so if we have 100 people and they all reshelve the same book, we have no idea it's ever gone off the shelves. But if you put it back on the please reshelve shelf or carts, then we know that it's been used and we won't throw it away. So there you are, you're warned.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So there's some didactic value. for what we're doing. One change I sense, and I haven't been in enough recently to note this, but certainly as you would go into the main room of the library, whatever we want to call it, which was changed in that 1990 renovation, you always had a magnificent collection of periodicals and the newspapers on a roll. And one of the things that I sense is magazine culture is diminishing, and there are fewer. And one Vermont library that I recently went through to attend an event, I was just aghast at how few periodicals. And do you want to speak to that? So for example, fewer periodical subscriptions?
You can't shelve what isn't being printed.
Okay.
Is the first. Because if you know, books, novels are novels. They're 200 to 800 pages. They're designed to sit down and read a chunk of. Magazines, by virtue, are short, quick reading. You know, Harper's not necessarily, but most magazines are little tiny bits of information, easily consumed on a given topic. Well, that's what cell phones provide. It's exactly what cell phones provide. And so magazines are folding like mad. We used to not check them out because there was so much demand that if you didn't have the most recent copy of a given magazine, there'd be concern. We now check out all but the most recent issue of all of our magazines simply to keep them relevant. If we were to say you have to come to the library and read a magazine, there would be very little point in having them anymore. So the collection is shrinking a bit. It's still a good size, but many titles that we used to they would be standard have just gone away. One of the flagship magazines is Sports Illustrated. It was recently bought out by a pay-per-click company on the internet. So there's more revenue to be had from having little annoying pop-ups for the swimsuit issue online than there is from the entire print model for Sports Illustrated, just as an example.
Yeah. Does the library still invest in print encyclopedias? So let me just tell you about that. My parents and I grew up in a home rich with books, but my mother and father would not invest in an encyclopedia. You could go to the A&P and you could get the Funkin' Wagonal with $30 worth of groceries and $1.25. So I got to volume C of the Funkin' Wagonal, and that's, you know, they're long since gone. But my mother would always say, you can go to the library and look it up, because as soon as a set of encyclopedias is printed, it's already obsolete. So you think of the cost of what the Britannica, the world's oldest encyclopedia, does the library still do that? Because it's an enormous investment of periodicals to buy a print set of encyclopedias.
We have a set of encyclopedias. I don't honestly know if we will replace it when we deem it no longer accurate enough to keep on the shelf. I also have an encyclopedia story from my youth. My parents were not well off, but they were convinced by a door-to-door encyclopedia salesman that my sister and I would be lacking in our education if my parents did not have an encyclopedia in the home. And so they bought a set of encyclopedias that they really couldn't afford on subscription, buying a volume a month kind of thing, starting when I was born. And by the time I got old enough to read it, 90% of the information in the set was obsolete, and we almost never touched it. And
you have to buy the supplements.
You have to buy the supplements.
Yeah,
there we are. And that is, I mean, that's the issue. The equivalent right now, I guess, would be the zeros in the Dewey Decimal System. For those not familiar with Dewey, Melvin Dewey, who created the Dewey Decimal System, had his very careful delineation where the 100s are this and the 200s are that, and he understood that there would be fields of information that he doesn't know, so he left the zeros for that. But that was 120 some years ago, 130 some years ago, and so there's been a lot of knowledge added in that intervening time. And so you have everything from paranormal activity, aliens, computers, And they're almost in the zeros in the Dewey system because that was the leftover bits of information. So the zeros are my favorite, and they're also the hardest section to keep up to date because it's where all our computer books are. And by the time you get Windows 10 for Dummies, written and published and sent to the libraries, we purchase it, it's sent, it's cataloged, it's put on the shelf. Windows 11 is out, and why don't you have Windows 11 for Dummies? And so that's a constant struggle of keeping our information up to date, but it's also part of what libraries do. I mean, that's kind of the frivolous one, but we have a huge medical section, for instance. And you absolutely have to weed that collection, weeding being the library term for picking books out and disposing of them. You have to weed the collection because you don't want somebody coming in with a life-threatening illness, going into your collection, picking out a book from 1992 that says, here's the treatment, and they have 3 more modern treatments available since then.
Right.
So it is just part of a librarian's job. Great big fat sets of encyclopedias are just, they're kind of the visual that leap to mind for a lot of people. It's exactly what we do, yes. And in terms of the role of the librarian, we used to be that gatekeeper very much. And that role has reduced now because people look stuff up on the internet. But one thing we do is we are sort of the gatekeepers of accurate information. There's lots of information on the internet. Some of it is accurate, some of it's really good. Wikipedia is underrated in terms of its accuracy. It's really very good.
Cite their sources.
And that's the trick. As you go in, you don't so much read the Wikipedia article as you go down to the list of sources and see what's there and go, ooh, that's an interesting one. And then maybe you go to your public library and borrow the source from that Wikipedia used, right, if you're interested in the subject. But one thing we do is we spend a lot of time to make sure that what's on our shelves is as accurate as we can make it. And that's something that the internet is not in the business of doing.
So on the shelves is a perfect segue to us talking
Ooh, I know what we're going now.
about books. And you know, certainly the Vermont Library, the Vermont College Library's decision, digital only, is something that just is hard for many people to accept. And to use a term that would tie us together, and I was not aware of this term until I took my last Google class several years ago, and the instructor, who was probably 30 years younger than I, said, well, you are a DI. And I said, a DI? What's a DI? He said, you are a digital immigrant. He said, you have to realize that everyone that you're teaching today is a digital native. But why do we need to value books that we can hold, books that you brought in, like this wonderful souvenir of the 1947 flood? Why is it important for, and again, I'm baiting the question here, why are libraries, why should they still be holding on to books that we can hold?
Wow, that's, do we have 3 or 4 more of these conversations? There's so many reasons. You can start with the physiological ones. People actually read print differently than they read online. People at the end of a long day, I read my computer screen constantly at work. I want to read print when I get home. So those are like really, really basic reasons. People want to read print. Most of the people we have who read ebooks or who borrow downloadable audiobooks also borrow print. So you don't have to be in the print camp or in the digital camp to enjoy both. And I certainly have found instances where it made sense for me to use digital. I drove out to Buffalo a while back, and I got to the extent of Vermont Public's broadcast distance, and I stopped in a parking lot in Queensbury, New York, and I downloaded a book onto my phone, and I listened to that book for the entire rest of the trip. Borrowed it, of course, from Rutland Free Library using our Libby service. We're a nonprofit, so I can talk about this. And so there are uses for digital. From the state university system, they have a tech college. And for the reasons we just talked about, I can see them wanting to provide many, many digital resources. Because by the time you put a tech subject into print, it's going to be obsolete in today's world. But you talked about discovery earlier. Good old Dewey or the Library of Congress puts everything by subject. And so you go in and you know you want a book on any given subject, canning fruits and vegetables. And so you can find that digitally, and it will let you download the book on canning fruits and vegetables. But you walk into a library with print resources, and we're going to have everything on that subject adjacent on the shelf. So in the case of Rutland Free Library, we have about 4 linear feet of books on canning vegetables, fruits and vegetables. So you found the one, but in many cases it's not the one you leave with, and it's certainly not the only one you leave with. And it's that process of discovery that print libraries have that I can see digital working on it, but digital is probably 2 decades away from that. Mm-hmm. And then the other point, and yeah, I brought in a book. This one is, I don't know that it was ever in copyright. It is 1947, published 1947. It is titled The Flood at Rutland, Vermont. 1947, the official author is Aldo Marusi. Aldo was the longtime photographer of the Rutland Herald. And it is essentially just the Herald put together a book of all those photos with a few clippings of what happened during the Great Flood of 1947. And then there's a little tiny 3-paragraph summation by Aldo. This book is not available, to the best of my knowledge, digitally. It's such a minor title, it might never get swept up and digitized, put onto a computer so that you can find it and search it. And so by going digital now, we are creating a gap between 1924-ish. Sherlock Holmes just became available. The last Sherlock Holmes story written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle this year became available as out of copyright, so anybody can put it up on the internet, and mm-hmm. It is up on the internet, mm-hmm. And you can read everything by Arthur Conan Doyle. We have writers alive today, writing today, who started their careers before putting out an audiobook or an ebook version was part of what you did. Mm-hmm. So we'll have somebody looking for a book that's published this year, and I want to see the start of the series. Well, the start of the series you have to go back to print because it's not available digitally. Mm-hmm. Well, what do you mean? And the simple answer is they didn't make digital books until the early 2000s, mm-hmm. In any number, and it didn't become really common until around 2010. So you're risking losing everything between 1924 and early 2000s that wasn't super popular, so it'll be automatically covered for digitization, mm-hmm. including this fabulous volume available at Rutland Free Library, produced in 1947, mm-hmm. which is right in the heart of that. So it's a fabulous example of exactly what is at risk from relying on digital content. Is you're gonna lose stuff.
And I still think, we certainly hear about this in Vermont with broadband accessibility. Sometimes limiting something to digital only doesn't provide broader access to it.
No, and it's especially frustrating for the small schools. Castleton, we have pretty good digital coverage, pretty good broadband, but not up in some of our hill communities and certainly in the Northeast Kingdom. So you're saying to the smallest communities served by the smallest colleges that even though you don't have broadband, you have to rely on broadband to get your library services. It's I have written I wrote an op-ed for the Herald, and I wrote the Vermont Library Association's position paper arguing why this is a terrible idea. I will publicly defend the fact that it's a terrible idea, and I'm happy you gave me the platform to do it. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you. And again, I think that as people who are old enough to remember life before computers and how we accessed information and how we look forward to reading and bringing home books, we need to be aware about all of these changes, some of which are good, some of which are not. But one thing that I will share with you as a post note, I first taught 1984 in 1984. In coming back to teaching that book in more recent years, there's more of Orwell in the world alive and well today than when he first wrote the book in 1948. And among the ways that information gets manipulated and the rewriting of the past, that's a whole other show. But
Sure.
George Orwell was eerily prescient of things to come. So thank you.